about 7 o'clock in the evening. The wind was now diminishing, a sign, however, of a violent recurrence impending. The child was on the tableland at the extreme south point of Portland. Portland is a peninsula, but the child did not know what a peninsula is, and was ignorant even of the name of Portland. He knew but one thing, which is that one can walk until one drops down. An idea is a guide. He had no idea. They had brought him there and left him there. They and there. These two enigmas represented his doom. They were humankind. There was the universe. For him, in all creation, there was absolutely no other basis to rest on but the little piece of ground where he placed his heel, ground hard and cold to his naked feet. In the great twilight world, open on all sides, what was there for the child? Nothing. He walked towards this nothing. Around him was the vastness of human desertion. He crossed the first plateau diagonally, then a second, then a third. At the extremity of each plateau, the child came upon a break in the ground. The slope was sometimes steep, but always short. The high, bare plains of Portland resemble great flagstones overlapping each other. The south side seems to enter under the protruding slab. The north side rises over the next one. These made ascents, which the child stepped over nimbly. From time to time he stopped, and seemed to hold counsel with himself. The night was becoming very dark. His radius of sight was contracting. He now only saw a few steps before him. All of a sudden he stopped, listened for an instant, and with an almost imperceptible nod of satisfaction, turned quickly and directed his step towards an eminence of modern height, which he dimly perceived on his right at the point of the plain nearest the cliff. There was on the eminence a shape, which in the mist looked like a tree. The child had just heard a noise in this direction, which was the noise neither of the wind nor of the sea, nor was it the cry of animals. He thought that someone was there, and in a few strides he was at the foot of the hillock. In truth, someone was there. That which had been indistinct on the top of the great eminence was now visible. It was something like a great arm thrust straight out of the ground at the upper extremity of the arm. A sort of forefinger, supported from beneath by the thumb, pointed out horizontally. The arm, the thumb, and the forefinger drew a square against the sky. At the point of juncture of this particular finger and this particular thumb, there was a line from which hung something black and shapeless. The line, moving in the wind, sounded like a chain. This was the noise the child had heard. Seeing closely, the line was that which the noise indicated. A chain. A single chain cable. By that mysterious law of amalgamation which throughout nature causes appearances to exaggerate realities, the place, the hour, the mist, the mournful sea, the cloudy turmoils on the distant horizon, added to the effect of this figure, and made it seem enormous. The mass linked to the chain presented the appearance of a scabbard. It was swaddled like a child and long like a man. There was a round thing at its summit, about which the end of the chain was rolled. The scabbard was riven asunder at the lower end, and shreds of flesh hung out between the rents. A feeble breeze stirred the chain, and that which hung to it swayed gently. The passive mass obeyed the vague motions of space. It was an object to inspire indescribable dread. Horror, which disproportions everything, blurred its dimensions while retaining its shape. It was a condensation of darkness which had defined form. Night was above, and within the spectre. It was prey of ghastly exaggeration. Twilight and moonrise, stars setting behind the cliff, floating things in space, clouds, winds from all quarters, had ended by once been a man. It was that which is no longer, to be naught but a remainder. Such a thing is beyond the power of language to express, to exist no more, yet to persist, to be in the abyss, yet out of it, to reappear above death as if indissoluble. There is a certain amount of impossibility mixed with such reality. Thence it comes inexpressible. This being, was it a being? This black witness was a remainder, and an awful remainder. A remainder of what? Of nature first, then of society, not and yet total. The lawless inclemency of the weather held at its will. The deep oblivion of solitude environed it. It was given up to unknown chances. It was without defense against the darkness, which did with it what it willed. It was forever the patient. It submitted. The hurricane, that ghastly conflict of winds, was upon it. The spectre was given over to pillage. It underwent the horrible outrage of rotting in the open air. It was an outlaw of the tomb. There was no peace for it, even in annihilation. In the summer it fell away into dust. In the winter, into mud. Death should be veiled. The grave should have its reserve. Here was neither veil nor reserve, but cynically avowed. Purifaction. It is effrontery in death to display its work. It offends all the calmness of shadow when it does its task outside its laboratory, the grave. This dead thing had been stripped. To strip one already stripped, relentless act. His marrow was no longer in his bones. His entrails were no longer in his body. His voice no longer in his throat. A corpse's pocket which death turns inside out and empties. If he ever had a me, where was the me? There still, perchance. And this was fearful to think of. Something wandering about in chains. Can one imagine a more mournful lineament in the darkness? Realities exist here below which serve as issues to the unknown, which seems to facilitate the egress of speculation, and at which hypothesis snatches. Conjecture has its compère intérêt. In passing by certain places and before certain objects, one cannot help stopping, a prey to dreams, into the realms of which the mind enters. In the invisible, there are dark portals ajar. No one could have met this dead man without meditating. In the vastness of dispersion, he was wearing silently away. He had had blood which had been drunk, skin which had been eaten, flesh which had been stolen. Nothing had passed him by without taking somewhat from him. December had borrowed cold of him, midnight horror, the iron rust, the plague miasma, the flower's perfume. His slow disintegration was a toll paid to all, a toll of the corpse to the storm, to the rain, to the dew, to the reptiles, to the birds. All the dark hands of night had rifled the dead. He was indeed an inexpressibly strange tenant, a tenant of the darkness. He was on a plain and on a hill, and he was not. He was palpable, yet vanished. He was a shadow, accruing to the night. After the disappearance of the day into the vast silent obscurity, he became in lugubrious accord with all around him. By his mere presence, he increased the gloom of the tempest and the calm of the stars. The unutterable, which is in the desert, was condensed in him. Thief of an unknown fate, he commingled with all the wild secrets of the night. There was in his mystery a vague reverberation of all enigmas. About him life seemed sinking to its lowest depths. Certainty and confidence appeared to diminish in his environments. A shiver of the brushwood and the grass, a desolate melancholy, an anxiety in which a conscience seemed to lurk, appropriated with tragic force the whole landscape, to that black figure suspended by the chain. The presence of a spectre in the horizon is an aggravation of solitude. He was a sign. Having irreplaceable. Perpetual shuddering made him terrible, fearful to say. He seemed to be a center in space, with something immense leaning on him. Who can tell? Perhaps that equity half seen and set at defiance which transcends human justice. There was in his unburied continuance the vengeance of men and his own vengeance. He was a testimony in the twilight and the waste. He was in himself a disquieting substance, since we tremble before the substance, which is ruined habitation of the soul. For dead matter to trouble us, it must once have been tenanted by spirit. He denounced the law of the earth to the law of heaven. Placed there by man, he awaited God. Above him floated, blended with all the vague distortions of the cloud and the wave, boundless streams of shadow. Who could tell what sinister mysteries lurked behind this fountain? The illimitable, circumscribed by naught, nor tree, nor roof, nor passer-by, was around the dead man. When the unchangeable broods over us, when heaven, the abyss, the life, grave, and eternity appear patent, then it is we feel that all is inaccessible, all is forbidden, all is sealed. When infinity opens to us, terrible indeed is the closing of the gate behind. Chapter 6. Struggle between death and life. The child was before this thing, dumb, wondering, and with eyes fixed. To a man, it would have been a gibbet. To the child, it was an apparition. Where a man would have seen a corpse, the child saw a specter. Besides, he did not understand. The attractions of the obscure are manifold. There was one on the summit of that hill. The child took a step, then another. He ascended, wishing all the while to descend, and approached, wishing all the while to retreat. Bold yet trembling, he went close up to the survey, the spectre. When he got close under the gibbet, he looked up and examined it. The spectre was tarred. Here and there it shone. The child distinguished its face. It was coated over with pitch, and this mask, which appeared viscous and sticky, varied its aspect with the night shadows. The child saw the mouth, which was a hole, the nose, which was a hole, the eyes, which were holes. The body was wrapped and apparently corded up in a coarse canvas, soaked in naphtha. The canvas was moldy and torn. A knee protruded through it. A rent disclosed the ribs, partly corpse, partly skeleton. The face was the color of earth, slugs wandering over it had traced across it vague ribbons of silver. The canvas glued to the bones showed in reliefs like the robes of a statue. The skull, cracked and fractured, gaped like a rotten fruit. The teeth were still human, for they retained a laugh. The remains of a cry seemed to murmur in the open mouth. There were a few hairs of beard on the cheek. The inclined head had an air of attention. Some repairs had recently been done. The face had been tarred afresh, as well as the ribs and the knee, which protruded from the canvas. The feet hung out below. Just underneath, in the grass, were two shoes, which snow and rain had rendered shapeless. These shoes had fallen from the dead man. The barefooted child looked at the shoes. The wind, which had become more and more restless, was now and then interrupted by those pauses which had foretell the approach of a storm. For the last few minutes it had altogether ceased to blow. The corpse no longer stirred. The chain was as motionless as a plumb line. Like all newcomers into life, and taking into account the peculiar influences of his fate, the child no doubt felt within him that awakening of idea characteristic of early years, which endeavors to open the brain, and which resembles the pecking of the young bird in the egg. But all that was in his little consciousness just then was resolved into stupor. Excess of sensation has the effect of too much oil, and ends by putting out thought. A man would have put himself questions. The child put himself none. He only looked. The tar gave the face face a wet appearance. Drops of pitch congealed in what had once been the eyes, produced the effect of tears. However, thanks to the pitch, the ravage of death, if not annulled, was visibly slackened and reduced to the least possible decay. That which was before the child was the thing of which care was taken. The man was evidently precious. They had not cared to keep him alive, but they cared to keep him dead. The gibbet was old, worm-eaten, although strong, and had been in use many years. It was an immemorial custom in England to tar smugglers. They were hanged on the seaboard, coated over with pitch, and left swinging. Examples must be made in public, and tarred examples last longest. The tar was mercy. By renewing it, they spared making too many fresh examples. They placed gibbets from point to point along the coast, as nowadays they do beacons. The hanged man did duty as a lantern. After his fashion, he guided his comrades, the smugglers. Smugglers from far out at sea received the gibbets. There is one first warning, another second warning. It did not stop smuggling, but public order is made up of such things. The fashion lasted in England up until the beginning of this century. In 1822, 3 men were still to be seen hanging in the front of Dover Castle, but for that matter the preserving process was employed not only with smugglers. England turned robbers, incendiaries, and murderers to the same account. Jack Painter, who set fire to the government storehouses at Portsmouth, was hanged and tarred in 1776. L'Abbé Coyer, who describes him as Jean le Painter, saw him again in 1777. Jack Painter was hanging from above the ruin he had made and was retarred from time to time. His corpse lasted, I'd almost said lived, nearly 14 years. It was doing good service still in 1788. In 1790, however, they were obliged to replace it by another. The Egyptians used to value the mummy of the king. A plebeian mummy can also, it appears, be of service. The wind, having great power on the hill, had swept it of all its snow. Herbage reappeared on it, interspersed here and there with a few thistles. The hill was covered by that close short grass which grows by the sea and causes the tops of cliffs to resemble green cloth. Under the gibbet, on the very spot on which hung the feet of the executed criminal, was a long and thick tuft, uncommon on such poor soil. Corpses crumbling there for centuries past accounted for the beauty of the grass. Earth feeds on man. A dreary fascination held the child. He remained there open-mouthed. He only dropped his head a moment when a nettle, which felt like an insect, stung his leg. Then he looked up again. He looked above him at the face which looked down on him. It appeared to regard him the more steadfastly because it had no eyes. It was a comprehensive glance, having an indescribable fixedness, in which there were both light and darkness, and which emanated from the skull and teeth as well as the empty arches of the brow. The whole head of a dead man seems to have vision, and this is awful. No eyeball, yet we feel that we are looked at. A horror of worms. Little by little, the child himself was becoming an object of terror. He no longer moved. Torpor was coming over him. He did not perceive that he was losing consciousness. He was becoming benumbed and lifeless. Winter was silently delivering him over to night. There was something of a traitor in winter. The child was all but a statue. The coldness of stone was penetrating his bones. Darkness, that reptile, was crawling over him. The drowsiness resulting from snow creeps over a man like a dim tide. The child was slowly being invaded by a stagnation resembling that of the corpse. He was falling asleep. On the hand of sleep is the finger of death. The child felt himself seized by that hand. He was on the point of falling under the gibbet. He no longer knew whether he was standing upright. The end always impending, no transition between to be and not to be, the return to the crucible, the slip impossible every minute. Such is the precipice, which is creation. Another instant, the child and the dead, life in sketch and life in ruin, would be confounded in the same obliteration. The spectre appeared to understand and not to wish it. Of a sudden it stirred. One would have said it was a warning to the child. It was the wind beginning to blow again. Nothing stranger than this dead man in movement. The corpse at the end of a chain, pushed by the invisible gust, took an oblique attitude, rose to the left, then fell back, reascended to the right, and fell, and rose with slow, mournful precision, a weird game of seesaw. It seemed as though one saw in the darkness the pendulum of the clock of eternity. This continued for some time. The child felt himself waking up at the sight of the dead. Through his increasing numbness, he experienced a distinct sense of fear. The chain, at every oscillation, made a grinding sound with hideous regularity. It appeared to take breath, and then to resume. This grinding was like the cry of a grasshopper. An approaching squall is heralded by sudden gusts of wind. All at once the breeze increased into a gale. The corpse emphasized its dismal oscillations. It no longer swung. It tossed the chain. The chain, which had been grinding, now shrieked. It appeared that its shriek was heard. If it was an appeal, it was obeyed. From the depths of the horizon came the sound of a rushing noise. It was the noise of wings. An incident occurred, a stormy incident, peculiar to graveyards and solitudes. It was the arrival of a flight of ravens. Black flying specks split the clouds, pierced through the mist, increased in size, came near, amalgamated, thickened, hastening towards the hill, uttering cries. It was like the approach of a legion. The winged vermin of the darkness alighted on the gibbet. The child, scared, drew back. Swarms obey words of command. The birds crowded on the gibbet. Not one was on the corpse. They were talking amongst themselves. The croaking was frightful. The howl, the whistle, and the roar are signs of life. The croak is satisfied acceptance of putrefaction. In it, you can fancy you hear the tomb breaking silence. The croak is night-like in itself. The child was frozen even more by terror than by cold. Then the ravens held silence. One of them perched on the skeleton. This was the signal. They all precipitated themselves upon it. There was a cloud of wings, then all their feathers closed up, and the hanged man disappeared under a swarm of black blisters struggling in the obscurity. Just then the corpse moved. Was it the corpse? Was it the wind? It made a frightful bound. The hurricane, which was increasing, came to its aid. The phantom fell into convulsions. The squall, already blowing with full lungs, laid hold of it and moved it about in all directions. It became horrible. It began to struggle, an awful puppet with a gibbet chain for a string. Some humorist of the night must have seized the string and been playing with the mummy. It turned and leapt as if it would fain dislocate itself. The birds, frightened, flew off. It was like an explosion of all these unclean creatures. Then they returned, and the struggle began. The dead man seemed possessed with hideous vitality. The winds raised him as though they were meant to carry him away. He seemed struggling and making efforts to escape, but his iron collar held him back. The birds adapted themselves to all his movements, retreating, then striking again, scared but desperate. On one side, a strange flight was attempted. On the other, the pursuit of a chained man. The corpse, impelled by every spasm of wind, had shocks, starts, fits of rage. It went, it came, it rose, it fell, driving back the scattered swarm. The dead man was a club. The swarms were dust. The fierce assailing flock would not leave their hold. It grew stubborn. The man, as if maddened by the cluster of beaks, redoubled his blind chastisement of space. It was like the blows of long strides, his eyes closed, himself almost a phantom. He took flight, leaving behind that torment in the night. Chapter 7. The North Pont of Portland. He ran until he was breathless, at random, desperate, over the plain and into the snow, into space. His flight warmed him. He needed it. Without the run and the fright, he had died. When his breath failed him, he stopped, but he dared not look back. He fancied the birds would pursue him, that the dead man had undone his chain and was perhaps hurrying behind him, and no doubt the gibbet itself was descending the hill, running after the dead man. He feared to see these things, as if he turned his head. When he had somewhat recovered his breath, he resumed his flight. To account for facts does not belong to childhood. He received impressions which were magnified by terror, but he had not linked them together with his mind, nor form any conclusion on them. He was going on, no matter how or where. He ran in agony and difficulty as one in a dream. During the 3 hours or so since he had been deserted, his onward progress, still vague, had changed its purpose. At first it was a search, now it was a flight. He no longer felt hunger nor cold. He felt fear. One instinct had given place to another. To escape was now his whole thought. To escape from what? From everything. On all sides, life seemed to enclose him like a horrible wall. If he could have fled from all things, he would have done so, but children know nothing of that breaking from prison which is called suicide. He was running. He ran on for an indefinite time, but fear dies with lack of breath. All at once, as if seized by the sudden ascension of energy and intelligence, he stopped. One would have said he was ashamed of running away. He drew himself up, stamped his foot, and with head erect, looked around. There was no longer a hill, nor gibbet, nor flights of crows. The fog had resumed possession of the horizon. The child pursued his way. He no longer ran, but walked. To say that meeting with a corpse had made a man of him would be to limit the manifold and confused impression which possessed him. There was in his impression much more and much less. The gibbet, a mighty trouble in the rudiment of comprehension, nascent in his mind, still seemed to him an apparition, but a trouble overcame his strength gained, and he felt himself stronger. Had he been of an age to probe self, he would have detected within him 1,000 other germs of meditation. But the reflection of children is shapeless. At the utmost they feel is the bitter aftertaste of that which obscured them. The man later on calls indignation. What is add that to a child? As the faculty of quickly accepting the conclusion of a sensation, the distant fading boundaries which amplify painful subjects escape him. A child is protected by the limit of feebleness against emotions which are too complex. He sees the fact, and little else beside. The difficulty of being satisfied by half ideas does not exist for him. It is not until later that experience comes with its brief to conduct the lawsuit of life. Then he confronts groups of facts which have crossed his path. The understanding, cultivated and enlarged, draws comparisons. The memories of youth reappear under the passions, like the traces of a palimpsest under the erasure. These memories form the bases of logic, and that which was a vision in a child's brain becomes a syllogism in the man's. However, experience is various and turns to good or evil according to the natural disposition. When the good it ripens, and with the bad it rots. The child had run quite a quarter of a league, and walked another quarter, when suddenly he felt the craving of hunger. A thought which altogether eclipsed the hideous apparition on the hill occurred to him forcibly that he must eat. Happily, there is a man, in man, a brute seen the footprints he left in the snow. He recognized nothing. He was crossing the plain of Portland from south to north, and it is probable that the band with which he had come to avoid meeting anyone had crossed it from east to west. They had most likely sailed in some fisherman's or smuggler's boat from a point on the coast of Hugo, such as St. Catherine's Cape or Swan Cry, to Portland, to find the hooker which awaited them. They must have landed in one of the creeks of Weston and re-embarked on one of those of Easton. That direction which was intersected by the one of the child was now following. It was impossible for him to recognize the road. On the plain of Portland there are, here and there, raised strips of land abruptly ended by the shore and cut perpendicular to the sea. The wandering child reached one of these culminating points and stopped on it, hoping to see a larger space might reveal further indications. He tried to see around him. Before him, in a place of horizon, was a vast, livid opacity. He looked at it attentively. Under the fixedness of his glance, it became less indistinct. At the base of a distant fold of land, towards the east, in the depths of that opaque lividity, a moving and wan sort of precipice, which resembled the cliff of the night, crept and floated some vague black rents of some dim shreds of vapor. The pale opacity was fog. The black shreds were smoke. Where there is smoke, there are men. The child turned his steps in that direction. He saw some distance off a descent, and at the foot of the descent, among shapeless conformations of rock, blurred by the mist, what seemed to be either a sandbank or a tongue of land, joining probably to the plains of the horizon to the tableland he had just crossed. It was evident he must pass that way. He had, in fact, arrived at the isthmus of Portland, a alluvium, which is called Chess Hill. He began to descend the side of the plateau. The descent was difficult and rough. It was, with less of ruggedness, however, the reverse of the ascent he had made on leaving the creek. Every ascent is balanced by a decline. After having clambered up, he crawled down. He leapt from one rock to another, at the risk of sprain, at the risk of falling into the vague depths below. To save himself when he slipped on the rock or the ice, he caught hold of handfuls of weed and furze, thick with thorns, and their points ran into his fingers. At times he came on an easier declivity, taking breath as he descended, then came on the precipice again, and each step necessitated an expedient. In descending precipices, every movement solves a problem. One must be skillful under the pain of death. These problems the child solved with an instinct which would have made him the admiration of apes and mountebanks. The descent was steep and long. Nevertheless, he was coming to the end of it. Little by little, he was drawing nearer the moment when he should land on the isthmus, of which, from time to time, he caught a glimpse. At intervals while he mounted or dropped from rock to rock, he picked up his ears, his head erect like a listening deer. He was hearkening to a diffused and faint uproar, far away to the left, like the deep note of a clarion. There was a commotion of winds, preceding that fearful north blast which is heard rushing from the pole, like an inroad of trumpets. At the same time, the child felt now and then on his brow, on his eyes, on his cheeks, something which was like the palms of cold hands being placed on his face. There were large frozen flakes, sown at first softly in space, then eddying, then heralding a snowstorm. The child was covered with them. The snowstorm, which for the last hour had been on the sea, was beginning to gain the land. It was slowly invading the plains. It was entering obliquely by the northwest, the tableland of Portland. Book the Second, The Hooker at Sea, Chapter 1, Superhuman Laws. The snowstorm is one of the mysteries of the ocean. It is the most obscure of things meteorological. Obscure in every sense of the word. It is a mixture of fog and storm, and even in our days we cannot well account for some of the phenomenon. Hence many disasters. We try to explain all things by the action of the wind and wave, yet in the air there is a force which is not the wind, and in the waters a force which is not the wave. That force, both in the air and in the water, is effluvium. Air and water are two nearly identical liquid masses entering into the composition of each other by condensation and dilatation, so that to breathe is to drink. Effluvium alone is fluid. The wind and the wave are only impulses. Effluvium is current. The wind is visible in clouds. The wave is visible in foam. Effluvium is invisible. From time to time, however, it says, "I am here." Its "I am here" is a clap of thunder. The snowstorm offers a problem analogous. The snowstorm offers a problem analogous to the dry fog. If the solution of the Galena of the Spaniards and the Guabar of the Ethiopians be possible, assuredly that solution will be achieved by attentive observation of the magnetic effluvium. Without effluvium, a crowd of circumstances would remain enigmatic. Strictly speaking, the changes in the velocity of the wind, varying from 3 feet per second to 220 feet, would supply a reason for the variations of the waves, rising from the 3 inches in a calm sea to 36 feet in a raging one. Strictly speaking, the horizontal direction of the winds, even in a squall, enables us to understand how it is that a wave 30 feet high can be 1,500 feet long. But why are the waves of the Pacific 4 times higher near America than near Asia? That is to say, higher in the east than in the west. Why is the contrary true of the Atlantic? Why, under the equator, are they highest in the middle of the sea? Wherefore these deviations in the swell of the ocean? This is what magnetic effluvium combined with terrestrial rotation and sidereal traction can alone explain. Is not this mysterious complication needed to explain an oscillation of the wind veering, for instance, by the west from the southeast to the northeast, then suddenly returning in the same great curve from northeast to southeast, so as to make in 36 hours a prodigious circuit of 560 degrees? Such was the preface to the snowstorm of March 17th, 1867. The storm waves of Australia reach a height of 80 feet. This fact is connected with the vicinity of the pole. Storms in those latitudes result from disorder of the winds, than from submarine electrical discharges. In the year 1866, the transatlantic cable was disturbed at regular intervals in its working for 2 hours in the 24, from noon to 2 o'clock, by a sort of intermittent fever. Certain compositions and decompositions of forces produce phenomena, and impose themselves on the calculations of the seamen under the pain of shipwreck. The day that navigation, now a routine, shall become a mathematic. The day we shall, for instance, seek to know why it is in our regions hot winds sometimes come from is supposed to be generally mortal. Jarabeja, one of the pilots of the Magellan, termed it a cloud issuing from the devil's sore side. The old Spanish navigators called this kind of squall La Nevada when it came with snow, La Helada when it came with hail. According to them, bats fell from the sky with the snow. The snowstorms are characteristic of polar latitudes. Nevertheless, at times they glide, one might almost say tumble, into our climates. So much ruin is mingled with their chances into the air. The Meridian, as we have seen, plunged resolutely into the great hazard of the night, a hazard increased by the impending storm. She had encountered its menace with a sort of tragic audacity. Nevertheless, it must be remembered that she had received due warning. Chapter 2. Our first rough sketches filled in. While the hooker was in the Gulf of Portland, there was but little sea on. The ocean, if gloomy, was almost still, and the sky was yet clear. The wind took little effect on the vessel. The hooker hugged the cliff as closely as possible. It served as a screen to her. There were 10 on board the little Biscayan felucca, 3 men in the crew, and 7 passengers, of whom 2 were women. In the light of the open sea, which broadens twilight into day, all the figures on board were clearly visible. Besides, they were not hiding now. They were all at ease. Each one resumed his freedom of manner, spoke in his own note, showed his pace. Departure was to them a deliverance. The motley nature of the group shone out. The women were of no age. A wandering life produces premature old age, and indigence is made up of wrinkles. One of them was a Basque of the triborns. The other, with the large rosary, was an Irish woman. They wore that air of indifference common to the wretched. They had squatted down close to each other when they got on board, on chests at the foot of the masts. They talked to each other, Irish and Basque, as we have said, kindred languages. The Basque woman's hair was scented with onions and basil. The skipper of the hooker was a Basque of Guipúzcoa. One sailor was a Basque of the northern slope of the Pyrenees. The other was of the southern slope, that is to say, they of the same nation, although the first was French, the latter Spanish. The Basques recognized no official country. Mi madre se llama Montana. My mother is called the mountain, as Salarius the muleteer used to say. With the 5 men who were with the 2 women, one was a Frenchman of Languedoc, one a Frenchman of Provence, one a Genoese, one an old man. He who wore the sombrero without a hole for a pipe appeared to be German. The 5th, the chief, was a Basque of the Landes, from Biscarrosse. It was he who, just as the child was going on board, the hooker had, with a kick of his heel, cast the plank into the sea. This man, robust, agile, sudden in movement, covered, as it may be remembered, with trimmings, lashings, and glistening tinsel, could not keep his place. He stooped down, rose up, and continually passed to and fro from one end of the vessel to the other, as if debating uneasily on what had been done and what was going to happen. This chief of the band, the captain of the 2 men of the crew, all 4 Basques, spoke sometimes Basque, sometimes Spanish, sometimes French, these 3 languages being common on both slopes of the Pyrenees, but generally speaking, excepting the women, all talked something like French, which was the foundation of their slang. The French language, about this period, began to be chosen by the peoples as something intermediate between the excess of consonants in the north and the excess of vowels in the south. In Europe, French was the language of commerce, and also of felony. It will be remembered that Jibby, a London thief, understood cartouche. The hooker, a fine sailor, was making a quick way A Basque, as we have said, is neither Spanish nor French. He is Basque, and always and everywhere he must succour a Basque. Such is a Pyrenean fraternity. All the while, the hooker was in the Gulf of the Sky, although threatening, did not frown enough to cause the fugitives any uneasiness. They were flying, they were escaping, they were brutally gay. One laughed, another sang. The laugh was dry but free. The song was low but careless. The Languedocian cried, Caucanago, Caucana, expresses the highest pitch of satisfaction at Narbonne. He was a longshore sailor, a native of the waterside village of Ruizen, on the other side of the Clap, a bargeman rather than a mariner, but accustomed to work the reaches of the inlet of Bages, and to draw the dragnet full of fish over the salt sands of St. Lucie. He was of the race who wear a red cap, make complicated signs of the cross after the Spanish fashion, drink wine out of goat skins, eat scraped ham, kneel down to blaspheme, and implore their patron saint with threats. Great saint, grant me what I ask, or I'll throw a stone at thy head. He might be, at need, a useful addition to the crew. The Provençal in the caboose was blowing up a turf fire under an iron pot and making broth. The broth was a kind of puchero in which fish took the place of meat, and into which the Provençal threw chickpeas, little bits of bacon cut into squares, and pods of red pimento, concessions made by the eaters of the bouillabaisse to the eaters of Ola Potreda. One of the bags of provisions was beside him unpacked. He had lighted over his head an iron lantern, glazed with talc, which swung on a hook from the ceiling. By its side, on another hook, swung the weathercock halcyon. There was a popular belief in those days that a dead halcyon, swung by the beak, always turned its breast to the quarter whence the wind was blowing. While he made the broth, the Provençal put the neck of a gourd into his mouth, and now and then swallowed a draught of Aguardian tea. It was one of those gourds covered with wicker, broad and flat, with handles which used to be hung by the side of a strap, and which were then called hip gourds. Between each gulp he mumbled one of those country songs of which the subject is nothing at all. All a road, a hedge, you see in the meadow, through a gap in the bushes, the shadow of a horse and cart, elongated in the sunset, and from time to time, above the hedge, the end of a fork loaded with hay appears and disappears. You want no more, and make a song. A departure, according to the bent of one's mind, is a relief or a depression. All seemed lighter in spirit, excepting the old man of the band, the man with a hat who had no pipe. This old man, who looked more German than anything else, although he had one of those unfathomable faces in which nationality is lost, was bald, and so grave that his baldness might have been a tonsure. Every time he passed before the Virgin on the prow, he raised his felt hat so that you could see the swollen senile veins of his skull, a sort of full gown, torn and threadbare, of brown Dorchester serge, but half hid his closely fitting coat, tight and compact, and hooked up to the neck like a cassock. His hands inclined to cross each other, and had the mechanical junction of habitual prayer. He had what might be called a wan countenance, for the countenance is above all things a reflection, and it is an error to believe the idea is a verges upon grimace. But a severe man, withal, nothing but the hypocrite, nothing of the cynic. A tragic dreamer, he was one of those whom crime leaves pensive, yet the brow of incendiary tempered by the eyes of an archbishop. His sparse gray locks turned white over his temples. The Christian was evident in him, complicated by the fatalism of the Turk. Chalkstones deformed his fingers, dissected by leanness. The stiffness of his tall frame was grotesque. He had his sea legs. He walked slowly about the deck, not looking at anyone, with an air decided and sinister. His eyeballs were vaguely filled with the fixed light of a soul studious of the darkness and afflicted by reapparitions of conscience. From time to time, the chief of the band, abrupt and alert, and making sudden turns about the vessel, came to him and whispered in his ear. The old man answered by a nod. It might have been the lightning consulting the night. Chapter 3. Troubled Men on the Troubled Sea. 2 men aboard the craft were absorbed in thought. The old man and the skipper of the hooker must not be mistaken for the chief of the band. The captain was occupied by the sea, the old man by the sky. The former did not lift his eyes from the water, the latter kept watch on the firmament. The skipper's anxiety was the state of the sea. The old man seemed to suspect the heavens. He scanned the stars through every break in the clouds. It was the time when day still lingers, but some few stars began faintly to pierce the twilight. The horizon was singular. The mist upon it varied. Haze predominated on the land, clouds at sea. The skipper, noting the rising billows, hauled all taut before he got outside Portland Bay. He would not delay doing so until he should pass the headland. He examined the rigging closely and satisfied himself that the lower shrouds were well set up and supported firmly in the futtock. Shrouds, precautions of a man who means to carry on with a press of sail at all risks. The hooker was not trimmed, being 2 feet by the head. This was her weaker point. The captain passed every minute from binnacle to the standard compass, taking the bearings of objects on the shore. The Majutina had at first a soldier's wind, which was not unfavorable, though she could not lie within 5 points of her course. The captain took on the helm as often as possible, trusting no one but himself to prevent her from dropping leeward, the effect on the rudder being influenced by the steerage way. The difference between the true and apparent course being relative to the way of the vessel. The hooker seemed to lie closer to the wind than she did in reality. The brace was not a beam, nor was the hooker close hauled, but one cannot ascertain the true course made, except when the wind is abaft. When you perceive long streaks of cloud meeting in a point on the horizon, you may be sure that the wind is in that quarter. But in this evening, the wind was variable. The needle fluctuated. The captain distrusted the erratic movements of the vessel. He steered carefully but resolutely. Left her up, watching her come to, prevented her from yawning and from running into the wind's eye, noted the leeway, the little jerks on the helm, was observant of every roll and pitch of the vessel, of the difference in her speed, and the variable gusts of wind. For fear of accidents, he was constantly on the lookout for squalls. From off the land he was hugging, and above all he was cautious to keep her full, the direction of the brace indicated by the compass being uncertain from the small size of the instrument. The captain's eyes frequently lowered, remarked every change in the waves. Once, nevertheless, he was raised them towards the sky, and tried to make out the 3 stars of Orion's belt. These stars are called the 3 Magi, and an old proverb of the ancient Spanish pilots declares that he who sees the 3 Magi is not far from the Savior. This glance of the captain's tallied with an aside growled out from the other end of the vessel by the old man. We don't even see the pointers, nor the star it terrors. Red as he is, not one is distinct. No care troubled the other fugitives. Still, when the first hilarity they felt in their escape had passed away, they could not help remembering that when they were at sea in the month of January, that the wind was frozen. It was impossible to establish themselves in the cabin. It was much too narrow, and too much encumbered by bales and baggage. The baggage belonged to the passengers, the bales to the easily resign themselves. Open-air habits make it simple for vagabonds to arrange themselves for nights. The open air, la belle étoile, is their friend, and the cold helps them to sleep, sometimes to die. This night, as we have seen, there was no belle étoile. The Languedocian and the Genoese, while waiting for supper, rolled themselves up near the women, at the foot of the mast, in some tarpaulin which the sailors had thrown them. The old man remained at the bow, motionless and apparently insensible to the cold. The captain of the hooker, from the helm where he was standing, uttered a sort of guttural call, somewhat like the cry of the American bird called the exclaimer. As he called, the chief of the brand drew near, and the captain addressed him thus: Echioguana. These two words mean tiller of the mountain. With the form of Canterbury, a solemn preface to any subject which should command attention. Then the captain pointed the old man out to the chief, and the dialogue continued in Spanish. It was not, indeed, a very correct dialect, being that of the mountains. Here are the questions and answers. Echioguana, ¿qué es este hombre? Un hombre. ¿Qué lenguas habla? Todas. ¿Qué cosas sabe? Todas. ¿Qué pai? Ningún. Y todas. ¿Cuál Dios? Dios. ¿Cómo le llamas? El tonto. ¿Cómo dices que él le llamas? El sabio. En vuestra tropa que está. ¿Está lo que está? El jefe. No. Pues que está. La alma. The chief and the captain parted, each reverting to his own meditation, and a little while afterwards, Matutina left the gulf. Now came the great rolling of the open sea. The ocean and the spaces between the foam was slimy in appearance. The waves, seen through the twilight in indistinct outline, somewhat resembled flashes of gal. Here and there, a wave floating flat showed cracks and stars like a pane of glass broken by stones. In the center of these stars, in a revolving orifice, trembled a phosphorescence like that of a feline reflection, a vanished light which shines in the eyeballs of owls. Proudly, like a bold swimmer, the Matutina crossed the dangerous Shambles Shoal. This bank, a hidden obstruction at the entrance of the Portland roads, is not a barrier. It is an amphitheater, a circus of sand under the sea, its benches cut out by the circling of the waves, an arena round and symmetrical, as high as a Jungfrau, only drowned, a coliseum of the ocean, seen by the diver in a vision-like transparency which engulfs him. Such is the Shambles Shoal. There hydras fight, leviathans meet. Theirs is the legend. At the bottom of the gigantic shaft are the wrecks of ships seized and sunk by a huge spider kraken, also called the Fish Mountain. Such things lie in the fearful shadow of the sea. These spectral realities, unknown to man, are manifested at the surface by a slight shiver. In this 19th century, the Shambles Bank is in ruins. The breakwater, recently constructed, is overthrown and mutilated by the force of its surf. That high submarine architecture, just as the jetty built the Croisic as in 1760, changed by the quarter of an hour the course of the tides, and yet the tide is eternal. But eternity obeys man more than man imagines. Chapter 4. A cloud different from the others enters on the scene. The old man, whom the chief of the band had named elbows resting on his hips, with outstretched hands, the head on one side with open eyes and arched eyebrows, and a smile on the corners of his mouth, an attitude of curiosity, hesitating between mockery and respect. The old man, either that it was his habit to talk to himself, or that hearing someone behind him incited him to speech, began to soliloquize, while he looked into space. The meridian, from which the right ascension is calculated, is marched in this century by 4 stars: the polar, Cassiopeia's chair, Andromeda's head, and the star Angellic, which is in Pegasus, but there is not one visible. These words followed each other mechanically, confused, and scarcely articulated, as if he did not care to pronounce them. They floated out of his mouth and dispersed. Soliloquy is the smoke exhaled by the innermost fires of the soul. The skipper broke in. "My lord." The old man, perhaps rather deaf, but as well as very thoughtful, went on. "Too few stars, too much wind. The breeze continually changes its direction and blows inshore, hence it rises perpendicularly. This results from the land being warmer than the water, and its atmosphere is lighter. The cold and dense wind of the sea rushes to replace it. From this cause, in every upper regions of the wind blows towards the land from every quarter. It would be advisable to make long tacks between the true and the apparent parallel. When the latitude by observation differs from the latitude by dead reckoning by not more than 3 minutes in 30 miles, or by 4 minutes in 60 miles, you are true in the course." The skipper bowed, but the old man saw him not. The latter, who wore what resembled an Oxford or Coddington University gown, did not relax his haughty and rigid attitude. He observed the waters as a critic of waves and of men. He studied the billows, and almost as if he was about to demand his turn to speak amidst their turmoil and teach them something. There was in him both a pedagogue and a soothsayer. He was an oracle of the deep. He continued his soliloquy, which was perhaps intended to be heard. "You might survive if we had a wheel instead of a helm. With a speed of 12 miles an hour, a force of 20 pounds exerted on the wheel produces 300,000 pounds effect on the course, and more too in some cases. With a double block and a runner, they can get 2 more revolutions." The skipper bowed a second time and said, "My lord." The old man's eye rested on him, and he had turned his head without moving his body. "Call me doctor. Master Doctor. I am the skipper." "Just so," said the doctor. The doctor, as henceforth we shall call him, appeared willing to converse. "Skipper, have you an English sextant?" "No. Without an English sextant you cannot beware of the gusts and currents. The first cause the second. Tread wise. No abuse. The sea understands. Insult nothing. Rest satisfied with watching. I have watched, and I do watch. Just now the tide is running against the wind. By and by, when it turns, we shall be all right. Have you a chart? No, not for this channel. Then you sail by rule of thumb. Not at all. I have a compass. The compass is one eye, the chart the other. A man with one eye can see. How do you compute the difference between the true and the apparent course? I've got my standard compass, and I make a guess. To guess is all very well. To know for certain is better. Christopher guessed. When there is a fog, and the needle revolves treacherously, you can never tell on which side you should look out for squalls, and the end of it is that you do neither the true nor the apparent day's work. An ass with his chart is better off than a wizard with his oracle. There is no fog in the breeze yet, and I see no cause for alarm. Ships are like flies in the spider's web of the sea. Just now both wind and waves are tolerably favorable. Black specks quivering on the billows, such are men on the ocean. I dare say there will be nothing wrong tonight. You may get in such a mess that you will find it hard to get out of it. All goes well at present. The doctor's eyes were fixed on the northeast. The skipper continued. Let us once reach the Gulf of Gascony, and I answer for our safety. I should say that I am at home there. I know it well, my Gulf of Gascony. It is a low basin, often very boisterous, but I know every sounding in it, and the nature of the bottom. Mud opposite San Cipriano, shells opposite Cizarc, sand off Cape Benaz, little pebbles off Montcouch de Mimisan. I know the color of every pebble. The skipper broke off. The doctor was no longer listening. The doctor gazed at the northeast. Over this hazy face passed an extraordinary expression. All the agony of terror possible to the mask of the stone was depicted there. From his mouth escaped this word. Good. His eyeballs, which had all at once become quite round like an owl's, were dilated with stupor on discovering a speck on the horizon. He added, It is well. As for me, I am resigned. The skipper looked at him. The doctor went on talking to himself, or to someone in the deep. I say yes. Then he was silent, opened his eyes wider and wider with renewed attention on that which he is watching, and said, It is coming from afar, but not the less surely will it come. The arc on the horizon, which occupied the visible rays, and the thoughts of the doctor being opposite to the west, was illuminated by the transcendent reflection of twilight, as if it were day. This arc, limited in extent, and surrounded by streaks of greyish vapor, was uniformly blue, but of a leaden rather than cerulean blue. The doctor, having completely returned to the contemplation of the sea, pointed to this atmospheric arc and said, Skipper, do you see? What? That? What? Out there? A blue spot? Yes. What is it? A niche in heaven. For those who go to heaven, for those who go elsewhere, it is another affair. He emphasized these enigmatical words with an appalling expression which was unseen in the darkness. A silence ensued. The skipper, remembering the two names given by the chief to this man, asked himself the question, Is he a madman, or is he a sage? The stiff and bony finger of the doctor remained immovably pointing, like a signpost, to the misty blue spot in the sky. The skipper looked at this spot. In truth, he growled out, It is not the sky, but the clouds. A blue cloud is worse than a black cloud, said the doctor, and, he added, it's a snow cloud. La Nuée de la Nieve, said the skipper, as if trying to understand the word better by translating it. Do you know what a snow cloud is? Asked the doctor. No. You'll know by and by. The skipper again turned his attention to the horizon, continuing to observe. The cloud, he muttered between his teeth. 1 month of squalls, another of wet, January with its gales, February with its rains. That's all the winter we Asturians get. Our rain is even warm. We've no snow but on the mountains. Aye, look out for the avalanche. The avalanche water rises 50 feet with the spring tides and 25 with the neap tides. Here we are in slack water. I thought you looked scared. We'll sound tonight. To sound you must heave to, and that you cannot do. Why not? On account of the wind. We'll try. The squall is close on us. We'll sound, Master Doctor. You could not even bring to. Trust in God. Take care what you say. Pronounce not lightly the awful name. I will sound, I tell you. Be sensible. You will have a gale of wind presently. I say that I will try for soundings. The resistance of the water will prevent the lead from sinking, and the line will break. Ah, so this is the first time in these waters. The first time. Very well. In that case, listen, skipper. The tone of the word listen was so commanding that the skipper made obeisance. Master Doctor, I am all attention. Port your helm and haul upon the starboard tack. What do you mean? Steer your course to the west. Caramba! Steer your course to the west. Impossible. As you will. What I tell you is for the others' sake. As for myself, I am indifferent. But, Master Doctor, steer west. Yes, skipper. The wind will be dead ahead. Yes, skipper. She'll pitch like the devil. Moderate your language. Yes, skipper. The vessel will be in irons. Yes, skipper. That means very likely the mast will go. Possibly. Do you wish me to steer west? Yes. I cannot. In that case, settle your reckoning with the sea. The wind ought to change. It will not change all night. Why not? Because it is a wind of 1,200 leagues in length. Make headway against such a wind impossible. To the west, I tell you. I'll try, but in spite of everything, she will fall off. That's the danger. The wind sets us to the east. Don't go to the east. Why not? Skipper, do you know what it is? For us, the word of death. No, death is the east. I'll steer west. This time, the doctor, having turned right round, looked the skipper full in the face, with his eyes resting on him, as though to implant the idea in his head, pronounced slowly, syllable by syllable, these words. If tonight, out at sea, we hear the sound of a bell, the ship is lost. The skipper pondered in amaze. What do you mean? The doctor did not answer. His countenance, expansive and expressive for a moment, was now reserved. His eyes became vacants. He did not appear to hear the skipper's wondering question. He was now attending to his own monologue. His lips let fall, as if mechanically, in a low murmuring tone, these words. The time has come for sullied souls to purify themselves. The skipper made that expressive grimace which raises the chin towards the nose. He is more a madman than a sage, he growled and moved off. Nevertheless, he steered west, but the wind and the sea were rising. Chapter 5. Hardquanonne. The mist was deformed by all sorts of inequalities, bulging out once at every point of the horizon, as if invisible mouths were busy puffing out bags of wind. The formation of the clouds was becoming ominous, in the west as in the east. The sky's depths were now invaded by the blue cloud. It advanced in the teeth of the wind. These contradictions are part of the wind's vagaries. The sea, which a moment before wore scales, now wore a skin. Such is the nature of that dragon. It was no longer a crocodile. It was a boa. The skin, lead-colored and dirty, looked thick and was crossed by heavy wrinkles. Here and there on its surface, bubbles of surge, like pustules, gathered, then burst. The foam was like leprosy. It was at this moment that the hooker was still seen from afar by the child, lighted her signal. A quarter of an hour elapsed. The skipper looked for the doctor. He was no longer on the deck. Directly the skipper had left him. The doctor had stooped as if he were consulting it in reference to the seasoning. The doctor noticed the cord, not because it was a bottle of brandy, but because of a name, which was plated in the wickerwork, with the red rushes on a background of white. There was light enough in the cabin to permit the reading of the name. The doctor paused and spelled in a low voice, Harquinol. He then addressed the cook. I had not observed that cord before to belong to Harquinol. Yes, the cook answered, to our poor comrade Harquinol. The doctor went on, to Harquinol, the Fleming of Flanders. Yes, who was in prison. Yes, in the dungeon at Chatham. It is his cord, replied the cook, and he was my friend. I keep it in remembrance of him. When shall we see him again? It is this bottle he used to wear slung over his hip. The doctor took up his pen again and continued, laboriously tracing somewhat straggling lines on the parchment. He was evidently anxious that his handwriting should be very legible. At length, notwithstanding the tremulousness of the vessel and the tremulousness of age, he finished what he wanted to write. It was time, for suddenly a sea struck the craft. A mighty rush of waters besieged the hooker, and they felled her break into the fearful dance in which ships lead off with the tempest. The doctor arose and approached the stove, meeting the ship's motion with his knees, dexterously bent, dried as best he could. And at the stove where the pot was boiling, the lines he had written, refolded the parchment in the pocketbook, and replaced the pocketbook and the inkhorn in his pocket. The stove was not the least ingenious piece of the interior economy in the hooker. It was judiciously isolated. Meanwhile, the pot heaved. The Provençal was watching it. Fish broth, said he. For the fishes, replied the doctor. Then he went on deck again. Chapter 6. They think that help is at hand. Through his growing preoccupation with the doctor, insomnia sort to review the situation, and anyone near to him might have heard these words drop from his lips. Too much rolling and not enough pitching. Then he recalled to himself by the dark workings of his mind. He sank again into thought, as a miner into his shaft. His meditation in no wise interfered within his watch on the sea. The contemplation of the sea is in itself a reverie. The dark punishment of the waters eternally tortured was commencing. A lamentation arose from the whole main. Preparations, confused and melancholy, were forming in space. The doctor observed all and lost no detail. There was, however, no sign of scrutiny in his face, as one does not scrutinize hell. A vast commotion, yet half latent, but visible through the turmoils in space, increased and irritated more and more. The winds, the vapors, the waves. Nothing is so logical, and nothing appears so absurd as the ocean itself. Self-dispersion is the essence of its sovereignty, and is the one of the elements of its redundance. The sea is ever for and against its knots that it may unravel itself. One of its slopes attacks, the other relives. No aberration is so wonderful as the waves, who can paint the alternating hollows and promontories, the valleys, the melting bosoms, the sketches, how render the thickets of foam, blendings of mountains and dreams. The indescribable is everywhere there, in the rending, in the frowning, in the anxiety, in the perpetual contradiction, in the chiaroscuro, in the pendants of the cloud, in the keys of the ever-open vault, in the disaggregation without rupture, in the funeral tumult caused by all that madness. The wind had just set due north. Its violence was so favorable and so useful in driving them away from England that the captain of the Matutina had made up his mind to set all sail. The hooker slipped through the foam, as at a gallop, the wind right aft, bounding from wave to wave in a gay frenzy. The fugitives were delighted and laughed. They clapped their hands, applauded the surf, the sea, the wind, the sails, the swift progress, the flight It was with wild jubilee and delight that those on board saw the hostile land recede and lessen behind them. By degrees, the dark ring of ocean rose higher, dwarfing in twilight Portland, Pierbeck, Teenham, Kimmeridge, the Matravers, the long streaks of dim cliffs, and the coast dotted with lighthouses. England disappeared, the fugitives now nothing around them but the sea. All at once night grew awful. There was no longer extent nor space. The sky became blackness and closed in round the vessel. The snow began to fall slowly. A few faint lakes appeared. They might have been ghosts. Nothing else was visible in the course of the wind. They felt as if yielded up. A snare looked in every possibility. It is in this cavernous darkness that our climate, the polar waterspout, makes its appearance. A great muddy cloud, like to the belly of a hydra, hung over the ocean, and in places its lividity adhered to the waves. Some of these adherences resembled pouches with holes, pumping the sea, disgorging vapor, refilling themselves with water. Here and there these suctions drew out cones of foam on the sea. The boreal storm hurled itself on the hooker. The hooker rushed to meet it. The squall and the vessel met as though to insult each other. In the first mad shock, not a sail was chewed up, not a jib lowered, not a reef taken, in so much as a flight, a delirium. The mast creaked and bent as if in fear. Cyclones, in our northern hemisphere, circle from left to right in the same direction as the hands of a watch, with a velocity which is sometimes as much as 60 miles an hour. Although she was entirely at the mercy of that whirlwind power, the hooker behaved as if she was out in moderate weather, without any further precaution than keeping her head on the rollers, with the wind broad on the bow, so as to avoid being pooped or caught broadside on. This semi-prudence would have failed her nothing in case of the wind shifting and taking her aback. The deep rumbling was brewing up in the distance. The roar of the abyss, nothing can be compared to it. It is the great brutish howl of the universe. What we call matter, that unsearchable organism, that amalgamation of incommensurable energies which can occasionally be detected as almost imperceptible degree of intention which makes us shudder, that blind and benighted cosmos, that enigmatical Pan, as a cry, a strange cry, prolonged, obstinate, and continuous, which is less than speech, and more than thunder. That cry is the hurricane. Other voices, songs, melodies, clamors, tones proceed from nests and from broods, from clamors, tones proceed from nests, pairings from nuptials, from homes. This one, a trumpet, comes out of the knot, which is all. Other voices express of the soul of the universe. This one expresses the monster. It is the howl of the formless. It is the inarticulate finding utterance in the indefinite. A thing, it is full of pathos and terror. These clamors converse above and beyond man. They rise, full, undulate, determined waves of sound, form all sorts of wild surprises for the mind. Now burst close to the ear, with the importunity of peal of trumpets. Now assail us with the rumbling hoarseness of distance, giddy uproar which resembles a language, and which in fact is a language. It is the effort which the world makes to speak. It is the lisping of the wonderful. In this wail it is manifested vaguely. All in the dark palpitation endures, suffers, accepts, rejects. For the most part it talks nonsense. It is like an lawyers engaged in the lawsuit. We listen, we try to grasp the reasons given, the redoubtable for and against. Such a moaning of the shadows has brought tenacity of a syllogism. Here is a vast trouble for thought. Here is the raison d'être of mythologies and polytheisms. To the terror of those great murmurs are added superhuman outlines melting away as they appear. Humanoids which are almost distinct, throats of fury shaped in the clouds, Plutonian chimeras almost defined. No horrors equal to these sobs, those laughs, those tricks of tumult, almost inscrutable questions and answers, those appeals to unknown aid. Man knows not what to become in the presence of that awful incantation. He bows under the enigma of those draconian intonations. What latent meaning have they? What do they signify? What do they threaten? What do they implore? It would seem as though all bonds were loosened. Vociferations for precipice to precipice, from air to water, from the wind to the wave, from the rain to the rock, from the zenith to the nadir, from the stars to the foam, the abyss unmuzzled. Such is the tumult, complicated by some mysterious strife with evil consciences. The loquacity of night is not less lugubrious than its silence. One feels in it the anger of the unknown. Night is a presence. Presence of what? For that matter, we must distinguish between night and shadows. In the night there is an absolute. In the darkness, the multiple. Grammar, logic, as it is, admits of no singular for the shadows. The night is one. The shadows are many. This mist of nocturnal mystery is the scattered, the fugitive, the crumbling, the fatal. One feels earth no longer, one feels the other reality. In the shadow, infinite and indefinite, lives something or someone, but that which lives there forms part of our death. After our earthly passage, when that shadow shall be light for us, the life which is beyond our life shall seize us. Meanwhile, it appears to touch and try us. Obscurity is a pressure. Night is, as it were, a hand placed on our soul. A certain hideous and solemn hours that we feel which is beyond the wall of the tomb encroaching on us. Never does this proximity of the unknown seem more imminent than in storms at sea. The horrible combines with the fantastic. The possible interrupter of human actions, the old cloud compeller, has it in his power to mold, in whatsoever shape he chooses, the inconsistent element, the limitless incoherence, the force diffused and undecided of the aim. That mystery the tempest every instant accepts and executes some unknown changes of will, apparent or real. Poets have, in all ages, called this caprice of the waves. But there is no such thing as caprice. The disconcerting enigmas in which in nature we call caprice, and in human life chance, are splinters of a law revealed to us in glimpses. Chapter 8. Nix et Nox. The characteristics of the snowstorm is its blackness. Nature's habitual aspect during a storm, the earth or sea black and the sky pale is reversed. The sky is black and the ocean white, foam below, darkness above, a horizon walled in with smoke, a zenith roofed with crape. The tempest resembles a cathedral hung with mourning, but no light in that cathedral, no phantom lights on the crests of the waves, no spark, no phosphorescence, naught but a huge shadow. The polar cyclone differs from the tropical cyclone, inasmuch as the one sets fire to every light, and the other extinguishes snowstorm is a storm blind and dumb. When it is past, the ships are also often blind and the sailors dumb. To escape from such an abyss is difficult. It could be wrong, however, to believe shipwreck to be absolutely inevitable. The Danish fishermen of Disco and Palesen, the seekers of black whales, earn steering towards Bering Strait to discover the mouth of Coppermine River. Hudson, Mackenzie, Vancouver, Ross, Dumont, Deauville all underwent at the pole itself the wildest hurricanes and escaped out of them. It was into this description of tempest that the hooker had entered, triumphant and in full sail, frenzy against frenzy, when Montgomery, escaping from Rouen, threw his galley with all the force of its oars against the chain bearing at the sea in La Boule. He showed similar effrontery. The Matutina had sailed on fast. She bent so much under her sails that at moments she made a fearful angle with the sea of 15 degrees. But her good-bellied keel adhered to the water as if glued to it. The keel resisted the grasp of the hurricane. The lantern at the prow cast its light ahead. The cloud, full of winds, dragging its tumor over the deep, cramped and eat more and more into the sea round the hooker. Not a gull, not a seamew, nothing but snow. The expanse of the field of waves becoming contracted and terrible. Only 3 or 4 gigantic ones were visible. Now and then a tremendous flash of lightning of a red-copper color broke out behind the obscure superposition of the horizon and the zenith. That sudden release of vermilion flame revealed the horror of the clouds, that abrupt conflagration of the depths, to which, for an instant, the first tiers of clouds and the distant boundaries of the celestial chaos seemed to have here placed the abyss in perspective. On this ground of fire, the snowflakes showed black. They might have been compared to dark butterflies flying about in a furnace. Then all was extinguished. The first explosion over the squall, still pursuing the hooker, began to roar in a thorough pass. This phase of crumbling is a perilous diminution of uproar. Nothing is so terrifying as this monologue of the storm. This gloomy recitative appears to serve as a moment of rest in the mysterious combating forces, and indicates a species of patrol kept in the unknown. The hooker held wildly on her course. Her 2 mainsails, especially, were doing fearful work. The sky and the sea were as of inks, with jets of foam running higher than the mast. Every instant masses of water swept the deck like a deluge, and at each roll of the vessel, the hawse were now to starboard, and now to larboard, became as many open mouths vomiting back into the foam of the sea. The women had taken refuge in the cabin, but the men remained on deck. The blinding snow eddied around. Spitting surge mingled with it. All was fury. At that moment, the chief of the band, standing abaft on the stern frames, holding with one hand the shrouds and with the other taking off the kerchief he wore round his head, waving it in the light of the lantern, gay and arrogant, with pride in his face and his hair, in wild disorder, intoxicated by all the darkness, cried out, "We are free! Free, free, free!" echoed the fugitives, and the band, seizing hold of the rigging, rose up on the deck. "Hurrah!" shouted the chief. The band shouted in the storm, "Hurrah!" Just as this clamor was dying away, in the tempest, a loud, solemn voice rose from the other end of the vessel, saying, "Silence!" All turned their heads. The darkness was thick, and the doctor was leaning against the mast, so he seemed part of it, and they could not see him. The voice spoke again. "Listen!" They were silent. Then did they distinctly hear through the darkness the toll of a bell. Chapter 9. The charge confided to a raging sea. The skipper at the helm burst out laughing. "A bell, that's good. We are on the larboard tack. What does the bell prove?" "Why, that we have land to starboard." The firm, measured voice of the doctor replied, "You have not land to starboard." "But we have," shouted the skipper. "No, but that bell tolls from the land." "That bell," said the doctor, "tolls from the sea." A shudder passed over the across the trestle, a bell is hung. In bad weather, heavy seas toss the buoy, and the bell rings. That is the bell you hear. The doctor paused to allow an extra violent gust of wind to pass over, waited until the sound of the bell reasserted itself, and went on. To hear that bell in a storm, when the nor'wester is blowing, is to be lost. Wherefore, for the reason, if you hear the bell, it is because the wind brings it to you. But the wind is nor'westerly, and the breakers of Arachne lie east. You hear the bell only because you are between the buoy and the breakers. It is on those breakers the wind is driving on you, and you are on the wrong side of the buoy. If you were on the right side, you would be out at sea on a safe course, and you would not hear the bell. The wind would not convey the sound to you. You would pass close to the buoy without knowing it. We are out of our course. That bell is shipwreck, sounding a tocsin. Now look out! As the doctor spoke, the bell, soothed by a lull in the storm, rang slowly by stroke, and its intermitting toll seemed to testify to the truth of the old man's words. It was as the knell of the abyss. All listened breathless now to the voice of the bell. Chapter 10. The Colossal Savage, the Storm. In the meantime, the skipper caught up his speaking trumpet. Strike every sail, my lads, go to the sheets. Man down helms, lower ties and brails. Let us steer toward the west. Let us regain the high sea. Head for the buoy, steer for the bell. There's an offing down there, yet we've a chance. Try, said the doctor. Let us remark here, by the way, that this ringing buoy, a kind of bell tower on the deep, was removed in 1802. There are yet alive very old mariners who remember hearing it. It forewarned rather too late. The orders of the skipper were obeyed. The Languedocian made his third sailor, all bore a hand. Not satisfied with brailing up, they furled the sails, lashed the earrings, secured the clew lines, bunt lines, and leech lines, and strapped the fender shrouds on the block straps, which thus might serve as backstays. They fished the mast. They battened down the ports and bullseyes, which is a method of walling up a ship. These evolutions, though executed in a lubberly fashion, were nevertheless thoroughly effective. The hooker was stripped to bare poles, but in proportion as the vessel, stowing every stitch of canvas, became more helpless, the havoc of both winds and waves increased. The seas ran mountains high. The hurricane, like an executioner hastening to his victim, began to dismember the craft. There came, in the twinkling of an eye, a dreadful crash. Topsails were blown from the bolt ropes. The chest trees were hewn asunder. The deck was swept clear. The shrouds were carried away. The mast went to the board. All the lumber of the wreck was flying in shivers. The main shrouds gave out, although they were turned in, and stoppered to 4 fathoms. The magnetic currents common to snowstorms hastened the destruction of the rigging. It broke as much from the effect of effluvium as the violence of the wind. Most of the chain gear fouled, and the blocks ceased to work. Forward the bows, aft the quarters quivered under the terrific shocks. One wave washed aboard the compass and its binnacle. The second carried away the boat, which, like a box slung under a carriage, had been, in accordance with the quaint Asterian custom, lashed to the bowsprit. A third breaker wrenched off the spritsail yard. A fourth swept away the figurehead and the signal light. The rudder only was left. To replace the ship's bow lantern, they set fire to and suspended at the stem a large block of wood covered with oakum and tar. The mast broken in two, all bristling with quivering splinters. Ropes, blocks, and yards cumbered the deck. In falling, it had stove a plank from the starboard gunwale. The skipper, still firm at the helm, shouted, We can steer, we have yet a chance. The lower planks hold good. Axes, overboard with the mast, clear the decks. Both crew and passengers worked with excitement of despair. A few strokes of the hatchets, and it was done. They pushed the mast over the side. The deck was cleared. Now, continued the skipper, take your rope's end and lash me to the helm. To the tiller they bound him. While they were fastening him, he laughed shouted, "Blow, old hurdy-gurdy, bellow. I've seen your equal off Cape Magitaco." And when secured, he clutched the helm with that strange hilarity which danger awakens. "All goes well, my lads. Long live our Lady Buglows. Let us steer west." An enormous wave came down abeam and fell on the vessel's quarter. There is always a storm. In storms, a tiger-like wave, a billow fierce and decisive, which attaining a certain height creeps horizontally over the surface of the waters for a time. Then raises, roars, rages, falling on the distressed vessel, tears it limb from limb. A cloud of foam covered the entire poop of the Meridian. There was heard above the confusion and darkness and waters a crash. When the spray cleared off, when the stern again rose in view, the skipper and the helm had disappeared. Both had been swept away. The helm and the man they had just secured it to had passed with the wave into the hissing turmoil of the hurricane. The chief of the band, gazing intently into the darkness, shouted, "De Bordal de Nostro Trolls." To this defiant exclamation there followed another cry, "Let go of the anchor, save the skipper." They rushed to the capstan and let go of the anchor. Hookers carry but one. In this case, the anchor reached the bottom only to be lost. The bottom was of the hardest rock. The billows were raging with resistless force. The cable snapped like a thread. The anchor lay at the bottom of the sea. At the cutwater there remained but the cable end protruding from the hawse hole. From this moment the hooker became a wreck. The Meridian was irrevocably disabled. The vessel, just before in full sail, and almost formidable in her speed, was now helpless. All her evolutions were uncertain and executed at random. She yielded passively and like a log to the capricious fury of the waves, that in a few minutes there should be in place of an eagle a useless cripple. Such a transformation is to be witnessed only at sea. The howling of the wind became more and more frightful. A hurricane has terrible lungs. It makes unceasingly mournful additions to darkness, which cannot be intensified. The bell on the sea rang despairingly, as if tolled by a weird hand. The Meridian drifted like a cork at the mercy of the waves. She sailed no longer. She merely floated. Every moment she seemed to turn about, to turn over on her back like a dead fish. The good condition and perfectly watertight state of the hull alone saved her from this disaster. Below the water, not a plank had started. There was not a cranny, chink, nor crack, and she had not made a single drop of water in the hole. This was lucky, as the pump, being out of order, was useless. The hooker pitched and roared fitfully and frightfully in the seething billows. The vessel had throes as of sickness, and seemed to be trying to belch forth the unhappy crew. Helpless, they clung to the standing rigging, to the transoms, to the shank painters, to the gaskets, to the broken planks, to the protruding nails of which tore their hands, to the warped riders, and all the rugged projections of the stumps of the masts. From time to time they listened to the toll of the bell that came over the waters, fainter and fainter. One would have thought it was also in distress. Its ringing was no more than an intermittent rattle. Then this rattle died away. Where were they? At what distance from the boy? The sound of the bell had frightened them. Its silence terrified them. The northwester drove them forward in perhaps a fatal course. They felt themselves wafted on by maddened and ever-recurring gusts of wind. The wreck, then, being forward blindfold, they felt the abyss before them, over them, under them. It was no longer a run, it was a rush. Suddenly, through the appalling density of the snowstorm, there loomed a red light. "A lighthouse!" cried the crew. And if you made it this far, I hope you enjoyed it so far. And as always,